Mysterious Universe, Season 24, Episode 5. Coming up on the show, we've got China's assassin's Mace superweapons, accidentally faxing classified secrets, and the teleportation secrets of the US Navy. I'm Benjamin Grundy. Joining me is Aaron Wright.
A lot of dark and dirty secrets coming up on this episode.
A lot of secrets in the intro. We've mentioned secrets 3 times.
Why do we keep saying secrets?
How do you accidentally fax classified information?
Well, it may not have been an accident. It may have been a whistleblower trying to get information out, or it may have actually been some type of disinformation campaign orchestrated by none other than the AFOSI.
What's the AFOSI?
The Air Force Office of Special Investigations. And if you recall on that show that I did on Paul Benowitz and how his life was completely turned upside down, it was alleged that the AFOSI played a pretty big role in that, in messing up that guy's life by making him believe that there was some extraterrestrial force that was involved in these things.
Seems like we've got a lot of war stuff on this show, a lot of military stuff.
Yes.
A lot of espionage and intrigue. I'm still trying to figure out how we got here. It was something that you said earlier on in the week. It was something that you were researching that just spurred us off in the direction. I think you were talking about the Dongfeng missiles.
Kind of, yeah. It was this passing kind of interest that I had where I feel like everything kind of comes together with some of the research that we do. And someone emailed in and said, hey, since you've been discussing this, ancient Egyptian magic and occult practices, you should check out, these books. And I started looking, but I couldn't find them, but I'll order them. But they were saying, apparently the ancient Egyptians had this belief in invisibility practice, and that you could incant certain phrases and that would cause invisibility to take place. I thought, that's pretty cool. But when I was looking for it, I couldn't find any details on it online. It's just very rare. And obviously it's ancient Egyptian. So as I said, I don't read hieroglyphics. So I was kind of stuck.
Google's got a new hieroglyphics translation program.
I saw that. Yeah, I saw.
So you can start using it.
Yeah, Graham Hancock actually was tweeting about something about that. But no, I ended up getting lost. And I found this story from John Kettering. Now, John John Kettler, not John Kettering. John Kettler, I should mention his name correctly. He's a fascinating guy. He leans more to the extreme sides of, I guess, military, paranormal kind of stories.
Works for us.
Works for us, exactly. And he has this fleeting story about how essentially the US military possesses invisibility technology for their aircraft carriers.
That's right.
So I thought, okay, I'm going to follow. I just feel this is right. I'm going to go with this. And then I mentioned it to you. And then, of course, you said, well, I've been looking at stuff that's similar.
It's just funny that you brought it up, because as soon as you mentioned US aircraft carriers, I realized I'd finished reading, nearly finished reading 3 books on the topics of US aircraft carriers. Because back earlier in the year, I'd read Robert Spalding's Stealth War, how China took over while America's elite slept. And he mentioned the issue with America's aircraft carriers. It was the first time I've ever heard of it. And after that, I'm kind of still in Bill Gertz's Deceiving the Sky, which also mentions it, and it's also mentioned in Christian Brose's The Kill Chain book, which came out this year as well. So there's 3, huge books talking about American military supremacy or the decline of it, and that they're all talking about the aircraft carrier issue, which I'll explain in a moment.
Well, what I do like is that the Sky book that you were describing talks about the satellite technology that we've briefly mentioned on the show in the past, I think on a Plus episode, about how China has these satellites that can bring down, other nations' satellites very simply and make it look like it wasn't them. But funnily enough, I think that the show is going to go in this kind of way where I think yours is going to be a little bit of we're screwed, kind of doom and gloom.
Yeah.
But I'm going to dovetail it nicely, because some of the information I have, it might be explained from this more secretive black ops technology kind of world, that we actually have some protections against it.
And speaking of invisibility, if we have time later on in the show in the Plus extension, I did come across mention of a Native American tribe. I think they're in California. The name escapes me. Maybe I'll find it again in my notes later on in the show. But apparently the Native American belief was that Sasquatch have a initiation ceremony or a rite of passage for young male Sasquatch who are coming of age.
To do what?
Who are becoming men. And
Sasquatch men.
Yeah, Sasquatch men, adult Sasquatch, male Sasquatch. And part of the rite of passage was to jump out in front of a human hiker and wave your Bigfoot hands in front of their face without them seeing you.
So invisibility.
So you got to master your invisibility tactics.
Where did I read that today? I actually read something very similar to that. I think Brent Swanson had an article about that.
It was in The Cold Vanish, Seeking the Missing in North America's Wildlands, which I've been slowly making my way through. It's from John Billman, and it's kind of like, it's like a David Paulides Missing 411 book, but full gonzo journalism.
Right, okay.
Because...
Well, that would be difficult looking for vanished persons.
Well, it's a really an amazing story, and I don't think I'll tell a lot of it because the book is huge. He kind of weaves in other missing 411 style cases, just people going missing in the wilderness. But the main narrative is around this 22-year-old, I think he was, when he went missing, Jacob Gray. He disappeared it's at the Olympic Park in Oregon, that huge national park. And after he went missing, pretty soon after, his father, Randy, just completely upended his life, like sold his business, sold his house, just got a camper van and just started to look for his son.
Yeah, understandably.
Because it was one of these cases where the trail was just cold and there was no clues, there was nothing to go on, and he wasn't getting any help from the authorities, so he just thought, I'm going to find my son. And Billman joins him on the search. And it's wild. It has all the paranormal elements that we love from the Paulides tales, and it has all those questions that remain unanswered. Why people sometimes their remains show up in areas that have been searched 100 times by search parties.
But the fact that you mentioned that you got a story about an invisible Bigfoot out of that book means I have a feeling of where that book is going to head.
I mean, Billman says in the introduction, he's like, you can't start investigating this stuff without running into the portals and the aliens and the Bigfoot. And the guy's a skeptic. Like, he doesn't entertain any of that. But he says this is just part and parcel of looking into this. And because it's that gonzo journalist style, he's interviewing Paulides and he's talking to the Bigfoot hunters who are out there. And there is some kind of weird paranormal stuff that happens. So if we have time, we'll look into that for our Plus members as well. But you're right, I kind of wanted to set the scene for this episode and build up to your segment. And I wanted to talk about, first of all, Robert Spalding's book, Stealth War. Now, you've probably heard me or seen me on Twitter recommend this. I think this is the best book.
Great.
To just dip your toes into the reality of the military threat from China in terms of unconventional warfare. So it's not just hot warfare. We're not just talking about weapons. We're talking about lawfare, using the legal system, economic warfare, stealing intellectual property, hacking, cyber warfare, all those different types of warfare.
Espionage.
Now they're sending seeds.
I saw
People
that.
in America are getting random seeds from China, which is part of their unconventional warfare.
So that was fascinating to me because a number of people sent that in and I thought, oh, come on, it must be just, obviously it's a mistake. But no, the seeds that are coming in are part of invasive species.
Yeah.
So that if people are dumb enough just to throw them, I mean, maybe if they just throw them in the trash, they might accidentally somehow get into landfill and could spread. They could actually destroy the agriculture system of the US.
Yeah, there's one, I can't remember the name of it, but I'm sure I saw a documentary about it. It's some kind of weed that infests a bunch of cities in the United States, and you just cannot get rid of it.
Yeah.
And it'll just take out building foundations eventually. It'll just, you cannot remove it. It's impossible to get rid of it. You basically need to implode the ground to get rid of this weed. I think its origins are from Japan.
Oh, right.
But yeah, it's just another aspect of unconventional warfare. But what I wanted to focus on was Spalding writes about analysts that insist the US Navy has bigger and better ships than China. Their carriers, their aircraft carriers, far outnumber, they far outperform, they dwarf China's carriers or carrier. And it's all essentially true. So he says you'd be forgiven for thinking this gives the US a huge advantage. And it's one of these things that I keep seeing it posted online, Twitter comments, people in forums, Facebook, whatever, where anytime there's a war with China mentioned as a hypothetical scenario.
Well, even at the beginning of this year, I mean, it was like World War III was being mentioned and people are including China in that.
Well, the attitude is just bring it.
Yeah.
The attitude is, the United States will crush China. They'll send their bombers in. They're so far ahead technologically. Their military might is so far ahead. Bring it. It'll be over in no time. It's almost laughable, the idea that the United States military would lose to another country, right? But in terms of, let's just focus on this one thing, the US Navy. Spalding says this assumption that the US would have a huge advantage is wrong. He says China's geographic location and its missile capability provides it with a very comfortable defensive cocoon, which is where it sits. And while the United States has military installations in Japan and South Korea, as we know, and the daunting flexibility of those aircraft carriers, China has created defenses that nullify the power of those forces. So this is where this will tie into your segment later on.
Definitely.
The Dongfeng 26. This is where this missile comes in. China has this, well, they've got thousands of these things. They've got thousands of these precision warheads tied to this sophisticated command and control system. Spalding says it's Dongfeng 26 ballistic missile, which is 46 feet long, 44,000 pounds. It can carry nukes. It can carry conventional warheads. It was basically designed to obliterate aircraft carriers. So the DF-26 missile has this 2,500-mile range. So that basically means it can
strike anything, basically.
It can strike the US warships in the Western Pacific Ocean, including ships based in Japan. So Spalding lays out what this means. He says, do the math. In order to deploy a carrier's bombers on a mission in the South China Sea, the carrier would have to come within range of these DF-26 missiles and other missiles that would destroy it. And while the US Navy has these interceptor missiles, they're called the SM-6s, they can destroy supposedly the Dongfeng 26s that China has. The sheer amount that China has, the sheer amount that they'd be shooting at the aircraft carriers means that one of them's going to get through. And he says it's conceivable that an undetected conflict might end in 30 seconds. Game over. So the scenario we've been seeing lately is, of course, all the turmoil in the South China Sea. And the argument against China being able to take Taiwan, for example, is that, well, America will just send in their aircraft carriers and, what the hell's China going to do? There's basically this fleet of, fighter jets at their doorstep. What are they going to do?
Yeah.
Well, Spalding's saying what they're going to do is disable the aircraft carriers before they even get into range of China. They've got these Dongfeng missiles. And he says, look at it from an economic perspective, right? You've got this $30 billion ship and the whole missile system cost them $1 billion. Like, I think one of those missiles costs China $10 million. So they could take out a $30 billion ship.
For $10 million.
$10 million. Well, it's an economic win.
It's a little bit more than that. I think takeout is probably a little bit extreme. So I was reading about this today from other sources, and this is actually nothing new. I mean, what's being described here, particularly in this book, is really daunting. And I think it's good. I think it's good that it's daunting. I think that people are understanding the reason why this is so important is because the American military is underfunded in comparison to what other nations are doing at the moment. You can see why there would be some fear here that we're becoming too reliant and too relaxed. Oh, don't worry about it. They've got plenty of money and plenty of technology. But no, they don't. But what I was reading is this is nothing new. Back in the 1980s, there were people within the military-industrial complex that realized that Russia was developing hypersonic missile technology, which they only spoke about in 2018 or 2019, which actually came up. But back in the 80s, they were talking about it. And what was really disturbing is that obviously things were heating up in the Middle East. We had the first Gulf War in 1991, and there was some realization that the Russians had been selling these hypersonic missiles or the precursors to them to Iran, and they had a range on them that they could strike any aircraft carrier within the Mediterranean.
All right.
So even back in the 80s, there was this fear. So further to that, though, going back from the point I made before, was that with these particular Chinese missiles, these modern ones, you need to use 8 of them. 8 of them have to strike...
To sink it.
To sink it.
Right.
But you were pointing out that it's not just simply sinking it. If you hit the deck and you've wrecked the runway...
Yeah, you can just disable it. You don't need to sink the aircraft carrier to take it off the battlefield.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's still pretty hard to hit it with 8, but yeah, you're right, just 1 or 2 will be enough.
But that's just the first layer in this scenario. So he talks about China's sophisticated command and control network. It's known as the C4ISR, which stands for Command, Control, Communications, Computers, Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance. And that's their system in the Pacific. Now, he says you got to think of this system as the most sophisticated alarm and response system on the planet. It creates operational and strategic advantages by using land-based radar, remote sensors, manned and unmanned military platforms, intelligence data to optimize outcomes on the battlefield. And he says, look, the US has nothing like this, not even close. What the US does have is, and why they desperately need a system like the Chinese have, is they have a system that relies heavily on satellites. The US needs their satellites. He says on these satellites, if they're attacked or disabled, he says the US's ability to use some of our most deadly instruments of deterrence would be critically impacted. So now more than ever, we need to have a totally secure second network to ensure that our systems are safe and running at maximum efficiency. Now, the problems come in here because the foundation of the second network is going to be 5G.
And Huawei.
Huawei came very close to convincing the Western nations to let them build its infrastructure. That's a whole other topic. But it was the mention of the satellites here that I thought, well, I've got to tell you about Bill Gertz's book, Deceiving the Sky, Inside Communist China's Drive for Global Supremacy, because Bill goes into the details on these satellite systems. And this will answer the questions anyone might have had of why the US is developing a space force now. Mm-hmm. Is it just to have some pew-pew memes? Is it just,
is it just for fun?
Is it to hunt for aliens? Is it just, Trump measuring his dick? What is it?
No.
What's the real point? Well, Bill opens with an event in 2007 that some say ushered in this new Cold War between the China and the US. And he sets the scene. It was the morning of January the 11th, 2007. It's this cool, clear winter day at the PLA's Army Satellite Launch Center in Xichang, in China's southern Sichuan province. They had a commercial version of the Dongfeng 21 ballistic missile. It's known as the KT-1 rocket, and it's ready on this mobile launcher. And mounted on the last stage of this missile is one of the most secret weapons that the People's Liberation Army have ever developed. It's the SC-19 Direct Ascent Anti-Satellite Missile. Now, at around 6 a.m., the order went out to fire this thing. And within seconds, the U.S. Air Force airmen inside this kind of windowless secret room in Colorado, they're watching on their computer screens. They can see the heat signature of this thing that China's just launched, and they're watching it. And they can see it, flying, heading toward 22,000 miles above the Earth. And they'd seen these tests before, right? They'd seen these missiles launched before. But they knew straight away that something about this test was different, because in the other tests, the missile would head for a landing zone in the Gobi Desert. And it's just, here we go, another Chinese missile test, and boom. But this missile did something different. It started flying into space and hit an unusual target. It hit the orbiting Fengyun 1C weather satellite. The Chinese took out their own weather satellite. Now, the satellite was destroyed instantly because it's a non-explosive missile. It's like a kinetic kill vehicle, they call it. So it just takes out the satellite through impact. And it just slammed into the satellite at 5 miles per second. The satellite was destroyed instantly. And in the ensuing hours, Gertz writes, the destruction of the satellite spread tens of thousands of high-speed orbiting metal debris. It formed this deadly ring around the Earth, and it's going to threaten spacecraft for decades to come.
It's like that film Gravity.
Yeah, it's what I was going to say. Have you ever seen Gravity?
Yeah, that's what it is.
That's what took out Clooney.
But then why would they do that? Why would they want it? Because it would affect their future space travel as well.
Well, this was a shot that was heard around the world. And Gertz writes, within a few years, a new Cold War would erupt between the US and the People's Republic of China. Now, the scary thing about this is that the US intelligence community knew instantly what this was, but the event, they wanted to keep it secret. They didn't want to tell anyone until the trade magazine, Aviation Week?
Yeah.
And they call it Aviation Leak because they get so much stuff out. They broke the story on January the 17th that year. And until the disclosure, China had some international opposition from the US. They had, opposition from South Korea and Japan. They were doing quiet diplomatic protests over this missile launch. But everything was done in secret because no one wanted to upset the cherished relations with the communist state. No one wanted to piss off China. No one wanted to piss off business leaders that were doing business with China in the US. No one wanted to piss off the pro-China government officials. Now, Gertz takes a little side note here and explains this is a policy that had been in place since the 1980s. It was driven by academia. He points out that Joseph Nye from Harvard University was one of the early kind of main proponents of this, and he basically argued, look, if you call out China, if you call them our enemies, that'll make them our enemy. We can't do that.
Oh, bravo. That's really clever. The literati are wonderful.
That's what that was their thing, and that became the decades-long policy of dealing with China. This was the strategy. This is how the world's superpower was going to take care of this rising communist superpower.
But I mean, even though the Nazis weren't communists, they're essentially the Nazi party of the modern era.
Yeah, and the thinking was if we just trade with them, they'll eventually have democracy and freedom. That was literally a laugh, but that's been the thinking for 30 years.
If we just sell them enough stuff and they buy enough consumerism, they'll just suddenly become democratic?
Yeah, like some kind of weird Pokemon. They'll just morph. They'll just anamorph into democracy. When you think about it, like it's just the craziest thing, but that's been the strategy. But it's obviously been the biggest mistake. It's a huge mistake. There's no freedom in China. There's no democracy in China.
Well, that's the irony. They call it the People Liberations Army. There's no liberation. People are oppressed.
They've just grown in power. They've become a massive threat to the world. So he uses a quote from, the Chinese businessman, the billionaire who...
The one that disappeared?
No, the guy who basically lives in exile in a high-rise apartment building in New York City, and sometimes he's on his yacht. Guo Wengui.
Oh, vaguely, yeah.
He's worth billions of dollars, and he became a defector, and he exposed all this inside information on the Communist Party and what they actually want to do, which is destroy America. Well, he kind of explained, why the best way to understand why this Pokemon democracy shift didn't occur. He said the reason Western culture is losing out over communism is because Western culture is based on Christianity. He said, now this is based on mutual trust and common moral values. He added that Western culture is built on the morality of right and wrong. By contrast, the communist system turns truth and lies into exactly the same thing. Yeah. When truth advances the ideological cause, there's no hesitation. He says when lies are useful, they are used just as easily.
Yeah.
Not understanding that about communist China is why you are losing out, Guo said of the West. So that's kind of, there's more detail he has in there on the differences in philosophy. But in the initial days after this anti-satellite missile test, because that's essentially what it was, like why did they blow up their own weather satellite? You asked that a moment ago. They're testing anti-satellite weapons.
Was it also a display of what they could do? Did they want to intimidate the US?
Well, obviously they knew that the rest of the world would notice.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But if they really wanted to test it, that can't be avoided. They went into full deception mode after they destroyed the satellite. Chinese diplomats around the world, at first, they said, we know nothing. We don't know what this was. Eventually, they admitted to doing a test, but they used their classical, strategic deception and lies, saying that the test posed no threat to any other nation and did not target a third country, meaning anyone other than the United States. The communist official that was quoted said a further lie by saying that for the time being, China has no plans for further tests. Now, again,
Did they fire another rocket an hour later?
Well, this test was a dangerous disaster for starters, right? As I said, thousands of pieces of debris. They currently track 2,500 of these pieces on, tracking systems.
Yeah.
Because now...
it's like we're in this stew of metal.
Now anyone that's up there has to monitor these things because one of these pieces of shrapnel can destroy your craft or your satellite. Now there's also 100,000 smaller debris that are just going to be there for like 100 years and we can't track them. They're too small. Now, the audacious lies of the CCP after this was that all their future tests were actually to test like satellites to clean up the debris.
What?
They were basically saying after this, oh, no, that missile we just launched, we're testing how to clean up the mess that someone else made. I don't know who did that.
The opening scene to Moonraker or something?
So only a few months later, and this goes into the tactics again, both China and Russia, they start urging the US to sign an international agreement to ban weapons in space.
Okay.
So this whole movement to ban any kind of action in space, it comes from the country that's actively developing space weapons.
Because you know what that means, though? Then their competitors, their opponents, are caught with their pants down.
Of course, it's just like the Soviets were so heavily into disarmament during the Cold War.
Well, during the Cold War in the 1960s, and this is something I was looking into today because it comes up with what the US has been allegedly doing from reverse engineered technology. But in the 1960s, the Soviet Union was developing the Fractional Orbital Bombardment System, the FOBS. This was designed to deliver nuclear warheads from space.
Yeah.
This was the plan.
Yeah, they had all these strategies to make sure that the West basically started to dismantle their nuclear weapons. They wanted to de-nuke the West. I was reading another book recently called The Red Thread. The author's name escapes me, but she was detailing that, you know, the idea of the nuclear winter?
Yes.
That if there was an all-out nuclear war, basically all life on the planet would end because it would create this massive
plume,
cloud and blot out the sun, and then there would be no photosynthesis and everyone would starve. And it's all bullshit.
What?
Really? It was made up by the Soviet Union. And
oh, no, come on.
The guy that invented this idea boasted about it years ago and basically said, we were responsible for that. And they pushed it to Western academics that were pro-socialism.
Right.
And then they gladly repeated it, and it became this thing of, we've got to avoid nuclear winter. Everyone's going to die. It's a Soviet lie. But they made it up.
But even if that's not the case, I mean, if that is a lie, but which also kind of makes sense, right? I mean, I know that, nuclear weapons detonating everywhere. I don't believe it would throw up that much. But at the same time, wouldn't it create radiation clouds that would be moving around? That would be bad enough.
I don't know about, the particular details, but just the idea.
Yeah,
the meme
the
of
ultimate devastation,
nuclear winter, is a Soviet trick. It was never true.
Wow.
So the Chinese military added its voice to blatant lies and propaganda, Gertz writes, designed to stifle the international outcry over this anti-satellite missile test. On January the 9th, 2007, 8 days after the test, the PLA General Peng Guangqian of the Chinese Military Science Academy said, "The United States has slight neurosis. China already has the capability to send astronauts into space and bring them back. Destroying a satellite in space is just ordinary technology. What must be emphasized, however, is that all of China's space exploration is peaceful and completely responsible, and it also creates happiness for mankind." I love that quote. Isn't it true that the Chinese space weapons build-up creates happiness for mankind?
How about you stop harvesting victims? Maybe then I'd feel better. That would create more happiness for most people.
He says China has always advocated the non-militarization of space, and so far China has not carried out any military activities in space. Absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Everyone knew that. They continue to lie about this stuff. So there's 3 different types of ASAT, anti-satellite missiles, that Beijing refers to as the assassin's mace weaponry. These are weapons that allow a weaker power to defeat a stronger foe. Assassin's mace. This is what the Chinese call their super weapons. And it's kind of a Chinese term. It's kind of like us saying the trump card. Mm-hmm. This is our trump card. That's the term they use. This is our assassin's mace. Takes them out. And this assassin's mace programs that they have, Gertz goes into full detail later on. He says the threat posed to American and international security by Chinese space weapons is real and growing. Because you might be listening to this just going, big deal. Like,
who cares? Everyone's got advanced technology.
They can shoot a satellite. Like, so what? What's the big deal? Well, Gertz says Americans today are heavily reliant on satellites. We use them for communications, transportation, finance. People don't realize the getting money out of the ATM, that relies on the GPS network. Critical functions in Western society.
Power, water.
If the CCP can take those out, it will be a checkmate in a future conflict with China. He mentions a report sent by the Pentagon Joint Staff Intelligence Directorate designated as top secret. This came out in January of 2018. The assessment revealed that both China and Russia have built anti-satellite missiles and other weapons and will soon be capable of damaging or destroying, get this, every US satellite in low Earth orbit. Every single one. They'll be able to take out in minutes. They stated they would be capable of destroying US satellites by 2020, so probably already there. A less specific warning came from the Director of National Intelligence, Daniel Coates. He said this in May of 2018. He said, "We assess that Russia and China perceive a need to offset any US military advantage derived from military, civil, or commercial space systems and are increasingly considering attacks against satellite systems as part of their future warfare doctrine." He says both will continue to pursue a full range of anti-satellite weapons as a means to reduce US military effectiveness.
So this is an anecdote I heard where apparently Trump was talking about the electronic hardening of satellites. And I thought, why on earth would you want to harden satellites? And I thought, well, maybe he's heard about the idea of solar flares. Maybe one of his advisors has said, well, we've got an issue. But then now describing this.
Oh, yeah, it's got nothing to do with corona mass ejections. It's got nothing to do with the sun, although it would help in one of those crazy scenarios.
Well, this is the thing, right? Well, you're absolutely right. But I mean, we're talking, was it 2007 that they launched a kinetic weapon? What if they've got electromagnetic weapons? It'd be really simple.
EMPs are a part of it. So is cyber hacking. So the idea that you could essentially just hack into an enemy satellite and then start directing their weapon systems.
Yeah.
For friendly fire scenarios.
So this was a conspiracy theory I heard about MH370, is that it was a rogue nation, whether it was Russia or China, I don't know, but the conspiracy theory is that it was a demonstration to the US government that they could send any aircraft off course by altering its satellite communications with its global positioning system.
Yeah, it's like a live test. It's an interesting theory. No, it's not. I don't think it's far-fetched. Because, there's a whole chapter on the cyber attack initiatives. And the main one is essentially if you can take over a US military satellite, you could start directing friendly fire from US forces on other US forces.
Exactly. And it's not just friendly fire, though, because what drives the positioning of nuclear weapons? It's the GPS satellites.
Yeah. So China carried out a test flight of the Dongning 3 missile, which was this advanced interceptor, in February of 2018.
Such a bad name, though. Imagine getting hit in the face with the dong.
Well, this test was kind of cheeky, right? They shot this missile high into the atmosphere. Remember, this is only 2 years ago. And they intercepted a target missile. So they disguised it as a missile interception test, right? They took out one of their own missiles, right? But American national security officials disclosed that the missile defense aspect of this test was a ruse. It was designed to test its anti-satellite capabilities. This was a massive wake-up call. It demonstrated that China was not seeking to match American capabilities militarily, but seeking asymmetric advantage. And he had a quote from General John Raymond, who now heads up Space Force, I think, who said, "We are quickly approaching the point where every satellite in every orbit can be threatened." Now, if this isn't enough to be concerned about, you've also got to think about the mini assassin satellites they have.
Mini assassin satellites?
Yeah, so these things were first discovered in August of 2013.
How?
3 satellites were launched. Well, he obviously can't discuss how the US gets this information, but 3 satellites were launched on July the 20th, 2013. They were launched from the Taiyuan Satellite Launch Center in Shanxi province. They were on board a Long March 4C rocket booster. The satellites were later detected engaging in unusual movements in space. When the US was tracking them, they weren't moving like normal satellites. They were getting around. And it indicated that the Chinese were preparing for space warfare against US satellites. Now, these things aren't big. I think they're about 22 pounds in weight.
Oh, so it's tiny. It's like 9 kilos.
They're tiny little things. And before I tell you what these little mini assassin satellites do, let me give you a little bit of the backstory of how they were developed. and it involves the Clintons and Motorola. So why are you laughing?
Because Hillary can't just keep killing people on Earth. You're going to kill people in space.
Oh, it's just the gift that keeps on giving. The multiple satellite launch of that year back in 2013, it highlights, Gertz says, these disastrous policies of the Clinton administration. Because during the 1990s, they started to basically give China whatever they wanted. They loosened export controls on space and satellite technology transfers to China. They did this with nuclear technology as well, by the way. Oh. Within years, China had exploited this cooperation during the 90s. They worked with American satellite makers to improve the reliability of their long-range missiles, and it gave them the ability to launch multiple warheads on top of them. So can you imagine this?
Just the amount of face palming, honestly.
What are you doing? American companies basically gave China these capabilities to destroy America.
Because it's about money. Like they don't care what the long-term thing is. It's like military-industrial complex making huge amounts of money.
So here's the example Gertz gives. Motorola worked with China to launch Iridium communication satellites on the Chinese Long March booster. China obtained from Motorola certain specifications that were used to build an indigenous satellite smart dispenser capable of maneuvering in space and releasing multiple satellites for placement in orbit. So it's essentially a craft that carries these micro assassin satellites. But Motorola was like, oh, here's this thing. You can launch multiple satellites and you can talk to each other. You can have free Chinese TV. It's great. And the Chinese like, TV sounds good. But really, they knew they could steal this technology and they could use it to develop a payload system.
Perhaps I'm being unfair, though, because I think that, like, when you're describing it there, I mean, you've got the American companies that are probably coming from, they want to make a buck. But at the same time, they probably weren't even ever anticipating that the Chinese would have used it for death.
Well, remember the foundational policy since the 80s was if we just trade, eventually the Pokemon thing will happen and they'll transform. Now, there were reports as early as 1996 that warned that if China got this smart dispenser capability from Motorola, they would immediately develop it into an anti-satellite, payload system, right? And those reports were basically ignored. And this is exactly what happened in that launch in 2013.
Oh.
It took them around, I think, 17 years to take that Motorola spec that they stole, the IP, and start sending maneuvering robots into space as anti-satellite weapons. And that's what these mini satellites are. You got to think of them as robots.
You mean just like little robots, little arms that go swimming through space?
Yeah.
And what do they do, though? Do they grab onto a satellite?
I'll get to that in a second, because Gertz says this was a failure of massive proportions that now threatened not only American defense satellites, but the functioning of American society that is highly dependent on satellites for everything, from dispensing cash from ATMs to watching movies. And I wish I had a better recall of that segment I did years ago on GPS, because there was a book that came out. I'll see if I can find it to put in the show notes. There was a book that came out just on how much GPS is embedded into our modern life.
Isn't that terrible? I have zero recollection of that.
You don't remember that?
No.
Well, it must have been thrilling.
No, it's just...
But it just showed these GPS is connected with so many things you don't even think about. Like
That's true, though. You're absolutely right.
Getting food to the supermarkets, for example. Shipping is another big one. But, that's what's so scary about it is so much of the US and the world economy relies on GPS. And the most important stuff, though, like if the GPS stops working, all of this stuff stops working. But the most important thing is that American bombs stop working.
Yeah. So
America's major weapons stop working when GPS stops working. And the Chinese know this. A leaked Chinese technical report from 2013, it was entitled Research on the Voidness of GPS, identified GPS satellites as key factors used in guiding 80% of the bombs dropped during the 1991 Gulf War. The study said China could significantly hamper navigation accuracy for American precision-guided bombs by targeting only 8 satellites.
So that's a small number.
Precisely what they started to do. But then you might ask, well, okay, so the world is dependent on GPS for so many things. like banking and transport and, navigation and all of that. So if the Chinese take out all these satellites, won't their GPS and their navigation and their ATMs and banking, won't all that be screwed up as well?
Ooh, let me guess. They stole some technology and built their own.
Correct.
Yeah.
They have their own hardened satellite constellation network. It's known as the Beidou navigation satellite system. Again, it's newer because the US military's one is old, right? They didn't build it anticipating space warfare.
No, of course not.
It was built as a system that was untouchable, and it was for decades. But the new Chinese system, they've built it knowing that it needs to be hardened against foreign attacks. And they now have their own GPS system. They have their own targeting system. They have their own network that doesn't rely on America's or the West's GPS system. Now, this is where we get to what these little bastard assassin satellite robots can do. Of the 3 satellites, like they can all maneuver around. They got little jets on them. They can kind of take out other satellites. They can get into the orbital path and just smash into them.
I just imagine them being kind of cute though, which is terrible.
They probably paint a little face on it. But they can work in tandem, kind of like a drone swarm. So you could imagine if they could get a bunch of them up there. Like this is only a test with 3 of them. Imagine if they launched a bunch of payloads with dozens of these things. Well, of the 3 satellites that were tested, the one that received the most attention was the Shijian 15. Now, again, all of 3 of them had these little maneuvering jets, but the Shijian 15 had this mechanical arm with a pincer on the end. The extension is believed to be for attacking other satellites, grabbing them or crushing key components. So this thing's tiny, right? It could go up to like a major kind of really large American targeting satellite.
How big are those? Like the size of a car? Is that what we're talking about?
Maybe a little bit smaller than that, I think. But essentially go up to maybe the lens or whatever it is that's important and just crush it. And what can America do?
Nothing. It's useless then.
They can't do anything.
Useless. Yeah. Because it's physically destroyed. You can't get to it.
The strategic value of these little bastards, I mean, it's incredible. And then you can just take out, you can take out half of the US's bombers by taking out a bunch of satellites. So an American intelligence official told Bill Gertz, the author of this book, the 3 of them are working in tandem, the 3 of these satellites in the test. And the one with the arm poses the most concern. This is part of a Chinese Star Wars program. Until the 2013 microsatellite launch, Gertz says, defense and intelligence officials mainly worried about these kinetic missiles that China was launching from that 2007 test I mentioned earlier, and the ones that were disguised as missile defense weapons. But these new, stealthier assassin satellites, the attack capability was totally revealed by this test, and the official told Bill that the retractable arm can be used for a number of things to gouge, knock off course, or even grab a passing satellite.
Why would you grab it? To steal it?
Just throw it, just to have control of it. Now you've got control of it. Throw it off its orbit. So why doesn't the average Joe know about this? This is the thing that got me interested in this. Why am I still seeing just this general feeling that the US is incapable of losing a modern war? It's just, well, no one really considers the possibility that the US could lose.
They don't. I think it comes back to this post-Cold War world that we live in, where there's this belief, and I don't know if this is for all people, but I think for many people, there's this belief of, nuclear, mutual annihilation, so that every country that has nuclear weapons, you're not going to do anything because you're going to be destroyed by nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapons are obviously terrible, destructive, horrible devices. And if you've ever been to Hiroshima, you can just see the impact of what they can do. But at the same time, as a deterrent, they're a wonderful thing. But if you're
it doesn't really work when every country has them.
Well, it works because it means that no one will use them because it means complete global annihilation.
Yeah, no one's going to use nukes, but everything in between, they're totally going to use.
Exactly.
Right.
And well, the thing is, well, though, this is what I'm saying. Previously, they wouldn't used it. They wouldn't have done anything that would lead up to that because of the threat of nuclear weapons. But if you can disable the delivery of a nuclear weapon, then you'll do whatever the hell you want.
Exactly. Yeah, that's pretty scary if they're being... I don't know if nukes are... they must be directed by GPS.
They would be connected to satellites somehow, I'm sure. Maybe they have their independent system, I don't know, but they'd have to have a connection to satellites.
But back to that question, why isn't this more widely known? Why has the meme of American military superiority just held true? Why is it the idea of challenging it so far-field or far-fetched?
I don't know.
Well, he said the Pentagon was strictly banned by liberal anti-defense policymakers from condemning this test publicly.
Why?
Behind the scenes, officials wanted to avoid giving the military a justification for building American space arms to challenge and deter this new threat from China in space.
Oh, my God.
This is the thinking.
Oh, but why? What's the thinking? Like,
the thinking is we
You
don't
don't
want
wanna
to
piss
upset
off?
China. It's really that simple. We don't want to upset
could you
our
imagine
communist masters.
if during the Cold War, America turned around and said, oh, we don't want to piss off Soviet Russia?
Yeah.
We'd all be speaking Russian right now.
Listen to this. At the time of the space experiment, the Obama administration deliberately hid the weapons aspect of the test from the public. This was as part of the administration's penchant for not publicly discussing such foreign threats to American security. One official told Gertz that there is a Star Wars threat to our satellites, adding that the Obama administration did not want the American people to know about it because it, quote, would require plussing up defense budgets to counter the space warfare program. So, in other words, bad optics to spend more money on the US military.
Yeah.
Well, sorry about the optics, but America, you kind of got a responsibility to protect the rest of the world.
True. I mean, America
from China as well.
Absolutely. America is, the world police, essentially. This is what they are. This is what they do. And it's a good thing. So if they're not capable of standing up to it, we're in trouble.
I know. With volumes of evidence revealing the Chinese space warfare threat, Gertz writes, publicly the Chinese military continues to spread the disinformation that despite its preparations for space war, China remains a peaceful power with no intentions of bringing warfare to the heavens.
Oh, they have no idea.
And it's a quote again from one of the PLA colonels saying, we just bring happiness to the world. We're just launching happy satellites, happy missiles, happiness.
Is this like something out of South Park? It's really surreal.
It's really insane. And yeah, I'm hoping this goes some way to kind of explaining why America desperately needed a space force, and they're so late to the party. I really hope they just get on it big time and start hardening their satellite systems and spending money and building things to combat this threat. Well, because it's really scary. Like, we all rely on America's GPS system.
Yeah, and look, it's beyond that as well, because look, I'm not one for wanting to push bigger military budgets or trying to create more weapons. I mean, I think it's bad. But at the same time, what a lot of people don't understand is that the actual spending and development of these weapons is a deterrent in itself. And the more of a deterrent that it is, the less likely that they ever have to be used. And that's what's, it's like it's a contradiction.
Yeah.
But it's such a good thing because we have to stop these rogue countries that want to oppress people. I mean, people in the US talk about oppression. You have no idea unless you lived underneath a communist regime. Like the oppression, you want to protest? There's no such thing.
Yeah, there's no protest.
You get thrown in a gulag or a concentration camp.
So the other book that was in my trio of things to check out, and again, these will all be in the show notes, and they're perhaps listed in order of complexity. Like start with the first one, Stealth War, and then work up to the final one, which is The Kill Chain by Christian Brose. Now, Brose was interesting because for most of the prior decade, he had been John McCain's principal advisor on national security and military issues. So during the last 4 years of his life, McCain was the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and Brose was his staff director. So that basically means he led a team of defense policy experts and authorized and oversaw the entire U.S. defense program. Like, they allocated every dollar spent. So the guy knows what he's talking about. And he said for years, he and McCain had been pleading with the Pentagon to be clearer and more forthcoming with Congress and with the American people about how bad things really were in terms of the massive and rapid rise of China's military power and the decline of America's military supremacy. Like, they were just ringing alarm bells. Like, guys, wake up, wake up. It's really scary. And essentially the thinking was they didn't want to sound defeatist, so they just didn't talk about it. No one knew about it, so nothing ever got done.
Mm.
And he says it looked like things were starting to change in, I think this was back in, when did McCain pass away? Was it 2018, 2016?
I don't know. Good question. I'll have a look.
The year that John McCain died, it looked like things were starting to change because people were starting to speak out. Like the Rand Corporation did this major report saying US forces could, under plausible assumptions, lose the next war they fight.
2018.
2018. There was a presentation to Congress saying America's military superiority has eroded to a dangerous degree. The US military will perhaps lose a war against China or Russia. There's really stark warnings that have gone unheard, and the general population doesn't know about it.
No.
They just don't know about it. Like, for example, there was a presentation, like John McCain wanted a big briefing in the Senate. He called up all his Senate colleagues to hear their findings on the growing threat of Chinese military supremacy. 99 Senate colleagues were invited. A dozen showed up.
A dozen
showed up. They don't care. No one cares. So the person who provided the briefing that day was David Ochmanek, and he was the former Pentagon official during the Obama administration. He did this presentation, but the quote that I wanted to share with you, just to kind of put a exclamation point on this segment, is after he got out of the Obama administration, he started to speak publicly about the war games that he had been a part of with the US military. And war games, you think of war games as, just a bit of a fun time shooting some missiles. But
maybe they're actually exercises that are done for a purpose because they demonstrate power.
Well, war games are simulations
Yes.
of future wars. And he's done a bunch of these with the Department of Defense. And the US military, he says, uses them to model actual campaigns against rival powers.
It wasn't only recently that the US was conducting war games somewhere in the South China Sea or further down?
With South Korea.
Yeah, right.
So the opponent, when they do these simulations, the opponent is always the red team and the US military is always the blue team. And this was the quote from Ochmanek, who said, "When we fight China or Russia, blue gets its ass handed to it every time." He said, "We lose a lot of people. We lose a lot of equipment. We usually fail to achieve our objective of preventing aggression by the adversary." He said, "Everyone assumes, based on 25 years of experience, that we have a dominant military establishment, that when we go to war, we always win in terms of the US. We win big, and there isn't any question about this. And when you say to people, not so fast, they are shocked because they have not had this experience." The truth is even worse than he describes, because over the past decade, in US war games against China, in these simulations, the United States has a perfect record. He says we have lost every single time.
That's really disturbing.
Every single simulation run against the Chinese is a loss. And
why do they simply have, is that including what we've been talking about with the satellite technology, or are they just simply describing the amount of force they have?
I don't have time to go into.
Yeah, I'm sure it goes in a nutshell.
It goes into a scenario that includes factors of just the American forces being too far away from China. The Dongfeng missiles play a part of that.
And having such range.
The aircraft carriers will be taken out. Basically, because the aircraft carriers can't get close to the to the Chinese coastline, you can't have amphibious forces landing. There's no support for them because the missiles will, push back the aircraft carriers. The submarines that would be the most effective in the battle aren't in the right places. It would take them weeks to get there. And it's said that a war could be lost in a matter of hours or days, even as the US is planning to move into position for the fight. Like, they could be defeated before they even get into position.
Oh, that is scary.
Now, there's this kind of chilling quote of McCain in this introduction, where it's one of the last conversations he had with him before he died, where John McCain just, after this presentation where only 12 senators showed up, he was just slumped in his chair, really dejected. And he said, "Look, I just don't understand." He said, "I remember when the Chief of Staff of the Army testified to Congress in 1980 that we had a hollow force." This is what you were talking about earlier.
Yep.
It was shocking. It was front page news. And what is happening now is just as bad, McCain said. It's actually much, much worse, and no one seems to care. They don't even seem to want to know. And he said, McCain looked away from me and stared at the floor, and I will never forget what he said next. He said, future generations of Americans are going to look back at us and they're going to ask how we let this happen and why we didn't do more about it when we had the chance. So hopefully that's depressing enough to set up the rest of the show and allow Aaron to ease us out of it a little bit. To kind of, because the speculation with the story that was in the New York Times we mentioned on the Plus show, I've seen a lot of speculation over the study of UFOs. And we talked about this. We talked about reverse engineering crashed UFO technology because this was part of the quote that was in the New York Times that craft from not of this earth have been retrieved.
Yeah.
And there's this hope that America has somehow reverse engineered alien technology. And all this talk of America's military might declining to the Chinese Communist Party is exactly what they want you to think.
Potentially, yes. Although you did mention Motorola there, and that means that Motorola allegedly got a piece of reverse engineered technology, and they took it. And if they're working with the Chinese, they must have potentially given it to the Chinese, whether on purpose or through accident. I don't know. Just merely speculation.
It'd be amazing if a world war started and Trump's just like, look at the UFOs we've got. And these massive triangular, like they're painted red, white, and blue. They just kind of stream out over the Pacific. And China's like, wait, fuck you. And these ripped off identical copies just fly out.
But are really cheap and shitty.
Yeah, they're a little bit
break
shitty.
Apart.
They're a little bit shitty, but they're basically stolen reverse engineered alien technology. That would be a good scenario.
Well, it could be a good scenario. And you're right, Ben. You're right. I mean, you've got to remember all the books that you've referenced today don't obviously include any details that might be hinting at anything that could be reverse engineered technologies, extraterrestrial technologies, anything that could possibly cross into that area. So that's why it does look very daunting. It does look very scary. And you're absolutely right. It is something that needs to be addressed. It's something that people need to be aware of. But what if this is some massive disinformation campaign? What if this has been done on purpose to create this feeling amongst other world powers that, look, we can destroy the US, so we're not scared of the US, so we can do whatever we want, when the reality is in 2 seconds, the US can just simply press a button and utilize their technologies and completely obliterate any opposing force. And it's kind of good news. So
before you go on, can I just do an ad insert here?
Yeah, let's do an ad insert.
Because I haven't taken a break and I think we've got an ad on this episode. So if
We've actually been going for about an hour.
If you're a barnacle, get ready for an ad. If you're on Plus,
stick around.
And we're back. So this is part of the thinking that I've seen online quite a lot. This idea that there are secrets that haven't been exposed, obviously within the US military capabilities.
Deep secrets. And you know what? In the past, I would have just said, look, this is absolutely absurd. And I think most people would also think this as well that aren't inside this field, where you go, look, this is absurd. I mean, you've got people like Michael Salla talking about this. I mean, it's just complete craziness and madness. But in the light of that New York Times document and the reports that, Brett Tingley and we were speaking to him about, that, hang on a second, maybe there is. I mean, they're beginning to say that, oh, look, this is off-world technology. Maybe they got hold of it. We may not understand it to the level that the extraterrestrials do, but we have been able to reverse engineer it, and we've been reverse engineering it since the 1940s.
So we got into this because you were talking about aircraft carriers and the Dongfeng missiles. Is there something to suggest that we don't need to be worried about the Dongfeng missiles?
Yes. Okay, so let me tell you this little story. So first of all, I'm going to go into what Brent was talking about with the patents that we were, describing, that the US military, the US Navy in particular, was like, well, look, we have these technologies, and even though the patent office was saying, we're going to reject these because this technology doesn't exist, the science isn't correct, and people came forward and said, no, you're going to push these patents through because, trust me, the technology works. That technology, yes, it may have come from extremely advanced science. It might have, but there's another possibility that it has come from reverse engineered technology. And like I said, the reason why I got into this is because I was looking at invisibility coming from ancient Egypt, and I couldn't find much, and I will order those books, as I said. But I came across this just brief quote that was written by John Kettler. And as I said, John Kettler kind of leans more towards the extreme sides of these stories. There's no way I can validate this. I've gone to his website. His website's johnkettler.com.
Dude, that's all. If you've been to his website, that's enough for me.
Oh, okay, great. Because he's got all these stories. Like, these are incredible stories, and I'm going to tell you one. But no way to validate it. But I guess, in a way, I kind of feel like, well, how could you validate this stuff? This is highly top secret military technology. How could you validate it? So the story comes from the 1980s, and it describes that there was a US aircraft carrier. We don't know what the aircraft carrier was, but apparently it had been dogged at every turn by this Soviet spy trawler. And apparently what the Soviets would do is that they'd get fishing trawlers and commercial vessels, and they would utilize them to follow, not to actually intimidate, but just simply to track the movements of US vessels. And this was a fishing trawler. I'm like, well, hang on a second.
Well, the Chinese do the same thing with their fishing trawlers.
Exactly. But why is a fishing trawler, you're not going to be able to essentially, lose an aircraft carrier. It's too big. But apparently the reason for this is because the aircraft carrier, this was going on for days. The aircraft carrier, though nuclear powered, it just had, limited amounts of power. It could just keep on going. Whereas the trawler would hopefully run out of fuel and have to refuel. But for some reason, we don't know why, this trawler just kept up with it constantly. It didn't seem to be able to have to go back in. It just kept on going. So the skipper of this vessel started getting really irritated, and he described that he had to initiate a secretive technology that was on board this US aircraft carrier. So apparently what the skipper did is he looked down at the desk, he flicked a little switch and then pressed a button below it, and boom. Exactly. Allegedly, the aircraft carrier simply vanished in an instant, only to reappear hundreds of miles away.
Oh.
According to the quote, intelligence sources described the Soviet reaction as the equivalent of kicking an anthill. Apparently, everything that could fly or sail was pressed into panicked all-out hunt mode, looking for the aircraft carrier. And you're right, it was, well, as I said before, it was found hundreds of miles away. So
it teleported.
It teleported. Not only did it become invisible, so apparently it became invisible first and then teleported, but apparently the American skipper got his ass reamed for activating the highly classified technology because he did it too quickly. He did it too soon. Apparently they didn't want to reveal it to the Russians.
So he basically exposed the multi-trillion-dollar ultra top secret teleportation technology to a Soviet fishing trawler.
Spy trawler. So this sent shockwaves around the world. And of course, intelligence circles started learning this story of this disappearing aircraft carrier. And what's mad about this is that this seems to be an extension of the Philadelphia experiment.
I was going to say, it sounds like that kind of story.
Yeah, it sounds like the Now, if it is true, what's interesting about the Philadelphia experiment is that there's a lot of information out there about, like, it could be completely sensationalized, or it could just be that it was some type of classified technology that they were utilizing, but it didn't do anything that was described. It didn't teleport. It didn't become invisible. One of the things I was reading today was that the whole point about the Philadelphia experiment is that they were trying to demagnetize the hull of the ship. So where these ships would have been going through, and this experiment was done in 1943, so it's allegedly not from Roswell, because Roswell was 1947, the crash, and the technology that was retrieved from it was from 1947 onwards. But apparently, officially, officially, what the Philadelphia experiment was is that they laid cables all over the decks and around the hull, and it would demagnetize the hull because those vessels would have been traveling through areas where there were magnetic mines. And so it essentially would make the ships invisible to the magnetic mines, but not to the eye. But if you listen to other stories, apparently, no, that's not the case. It was deliberately designed to make the vessel invisible to the physical eye and also teleport it. And that was part of the story, is that apparently it teleported to a shipyard somewhere in Virginia, I think. Or it went from the shipyard where it was in and it went to off the coast of Virginia. So crazy, crazy kind of stuff. But
so is there any truth to this story of the aircraft carrier teleporting?
I have no idea. And that's the problem. As I said, there was no way that I could validate it. There's been hints apparently from people like Colonel Philip J. Corso. They've hinted to that maybe this technology does exist.
Is it real?
And to be honest with you, that's what I found myself doing for most of the day as I was reading through a lot of this stuff. I was like, is it actually real? But what it does bring us to is the story of Jack Schulman. Now, Jack Schulman is a really, really fascinating guy. And this guy, like I said, with the Soviets kicking an anthill, he kind of did the same thing with the intelligence community in the US. And so what I'll do is I'll start describing, because we might move some of this into plus, but I'll just give you a background about, what this guy has done and how reverse engineering alien technology may not be as far out as we actually think. So this information comes from a transcribed presentation that Jack did at the Global Sciences Congress in Florida all the way back in 1999. And Jack is the kind of guy that apparently, after all these events took place, the reason why he started talking about his story is because he started to be threatened. There were a whole heap of threats, which I'll describe, and bad things that happened to him and the staff that worked at his company. The company was the American Computer Company. They're still around today. I've actually got a Wayback Machine of, I think it was from 1998, and they've got like the worst Microsoft front page website that you could possibly imagine.
It's funny. I remember this story. I remember doing exactly what you've done this afternoon and searching for that company.
Yeah. So, I mean, you would probably know, if you've seen the image, you would probably actually know the image, because what he did is he posted this computer-generated, and it's in comparison to today's, computer-generated imagery. It obviously looks fake, of the Roswell lander.
Yes.
Of the alleged craft that crashed at Roswell. And all he did on his company website is post just a couple of phrases. One was, did 1947 UFO landing in Roswell, New Mexico lead Bell scientists to discover the transistor? Did Bell Labs dismantle spacecraft and learn how to make lasers and ICs, as in integrated circuits? That's all he put on his website. This completely turned his world upside down. And you've got some of the biggest companies that are involved in it. You've got AT&T involved in this. You've got Bell Labs. So AT&T essentially, Bell Labs became AT&T later on. You've got Motorola. You've got the American government. You've got, massive corporations. You've got the army. You've, of course, got aliens. I mean, this story just has everything, all because a guy simply asked a question on his website. So Jack says that he started this company many, many years ago, but he's been in the computer industry for about 30 years. This is all the way back in 1999. So he's been in there for a long time. And the problem was as well that I did go looking for details about Jack today, and I couldn't find any modern reference to him. Like any reference after the early 2000s seemingly has disappeared. The American Computer Company is still there. So they've actually got a new website, and the website is at the top. It even says that it's dedicated to him. And they just sell, like latest generation Intel computers. But there's no details anymore about any of this Roswell stuff. But, Ruth Parnell was the person who was at the Global Sciences Conference who, got this audio tape. Or she at least transcribed the audio tape. And Jack says that he's worked for IBM. He was a professional services management consultant, all very technical business analyst kind of things, nothing that's extremely special. But he says, he's developed a couple of things, and, he could be considered to be, a leader in electronics. But he said a few years ago, he got a very, very harsh dose of reality. So this is back in 1995. And he says it came in the form of a visit from a friend of mine. And he says, look, when I was very young, I got involved in technology through the virtue of an influence of a father's friend. He says, I grew up in central New Jersey, and this is around where AT&T and Bell Labs originated. And he says, my friend's father was the head of Bell Labs. He said because of this just fleeting connection, he ended up developing a friendship with his family. He said, I ended up going to private school. I ended up living in the same household as the head of Bell Labs and going to that private school and becoming a college roommate with his son. And I grew up around these various projects that were being conducted at Bell Laboratories in the late 1960s and the 1970s. And he says, look, I've always held out that AT&T was this rather magnificent institution. And he said, look, if anyone's worked there, you would know that this is really the holy grail of technologies. I mean, the defense community and the government has been involved in AT&T for a long time. He says, do you even realize that AT&T and Bell Laboratories actually ran our nuclear arsenal for 45 years? I thought, personally, I didn't know that either. But he said, look, throughout his life, his young life, he said there were a few people that he would meet. One was William Shockley. He said the other one was Jack Morton. These are names that will come up later on. They're not really household names, but they should be, because these guys were integral in the development of the modern computer age. Like, this is the reason why you're listening to this podcast right now through either your iPhone or your computer or through your car, is because of transistors. I mean, yeah, you might have vacuum tubes, but we're going to go back to, RCA radio times. There was this big difference. This is what people we take for granted, I think, that you don't realize that before transistors, you had massive vacuum tubes that were very unwieldy and that made things, you couldn't have miniaturized electronics.
Expensive to make.
extremely expensive to make, extremely vulnerable. I mean, God, people worry now when they drop their phone in the pool because its waterproofing will only last for half an hour. If you even slightly blew upon an RCA tube at some point, it could blow out. Well, I've had a couple of them in some of my amplifiers, and let me just say that even the subtlest of movement sometimes could blow these things away. So, I mean, we live in a very, very fortunate time, but it's possibly because this technology came from Roswell. And the reason why Jack believes this happened is because in 1995, he says this dear friend came to him. He doesn't give the details of who this friend is, but he says, look, he was a general. He worked at the Pentagon. He was a member of the Joint Chief of Staffs at one point. He was now a consultant. This is in 1999. He says, look, I've known him for a very long time through the Morton family and through Bell and when I was working for IBM. And he says that when this guy came to him, he says, look, I want you to analyze some documents that I've got in my possession. And Jack says, oh, yeah, okay, sure. It's like, he's like, I want you to give me, a technical analysis. And so he puts the documents out on the table and he starts, like flicking these documents out. And there's photos. And these photos, he's like, that's not technology. That looks like some type of spacecraft. And this general goes, yeah, it may very well be. He says, well, hang on, what is this? He's like, I don't believe you. I don't believe. He's like, look, these are documents that fell into my possession, and I want you to analyze the drawings, these pictures, these photographs. I want you to describe the technology, and I want you to make a determination about the veracity of these documents. I want you to help me authenticate them. And apparently Jack said, yeah, sure, fine. Look, no trouble, but I can tell you right now, this is all fake. This is not real. This is fake. I don't believe in aliens. I don't believe in UFOs. I don't believe in any of that. Someone's pulling your leg. This is ridiculous, but sure, yeah, I'm more than happy to prove you wrong. So this general says to him, oh, okay, great. Look, I want you to come and have a look. So it was only the photos and a couple of documents. He obviously didn't have all the information. And he makes this appointment to be taken to see where the remainder of the documents are by this general. So this general takes him to this home. It's just a normal suburban home. And he knocks on the door. And this older woman opens the door. And her name is simply Mrs. Jeffrey Prosecure. She doesn't want to give any other details. Apparently that's not her real name, but it's the name that she goes by. But Jeffrey Prosecure somehow obtained these documents, and we don't know how. We don't know if he was involved with Western Electric Laboratories in the 1940s, Bell Labs. Western Electric Laboratories was written over some of these documents, but we're not entirely sure. But he walks into the home, and she takes him down into this, into the back of the house where she just seems to have all these, just indiscriminate documents lying around. But he says there are 28 boxes of this material, like big archive boxes of this material. And he starts flicking through it, and he realizes that this is all technical information and research information about reverse engineering highly advanced foreign technology. Now, when it's foreign, Jack actually points out that he thought at some point, maybe this is from like some World War II Japanese or German black ops technology that's obviously been acquired by the US military at the end of the Second War, and somehow it's gotten to these labs and it's being distributed. But then other things started popping up that kind of gave him this indication that this was something that was non-terrestrial. And non-terrestrial apparently is a word that's included in some of these documents. And that's where he starts going, oh, okay. So he later finds out that the documents that he needs to analyze are part of a growing tome known as the Lab Shopkeeper's Notebook.
The Shopkeeper's Notebook?
Yeah, the Lab Shopkeeper's Notebook. So it's kind of like this, it's like a cute term for this mass of documents that relates to super secret laboratories that were essentially trying to reverse engineer these technologies. These technologies include nuclear technologies, anti-gravitic technologies, weapons technologies, force field technologies.
Force field?
Force field, teleportation technologies, and invisibility technologies. So he said, look, I was kind of caught off guard by this. This was really shocking to him. But he said, I wanted to go through these boxes of documents because he was intrigued. I mean, of course you would be. I mean, if you're a computer scientist and you get presented all these incredible documents, you would be intrigued. So he said the general apparently assigned a security guard to stay with him at all times because he was afraid that someone might come in and try and steal the documents. And he thought, well, no one's touched these in decades, so what would it matter? But intelligence has ways of, getting details. And I guess if all of a sudden, he's talking about it to his friend and details are coming out, you can understand why there would be some apprehension. But he says, he goes back to the general and he says it was Christmas dinner. It was Christmas Eve dinner. And he says to his general friend, he says, look, and this is the quote, "I've got something to tell you. I'm having a real problem with this because what you're showing me looks like technology that hasn't yet been developed. But what I mean is that humanity has not yet developed it. But the documents you're showing me are 49 years old. How is this possible?" And so, look, the general says to him, what I need you to do is you should verify the age of the documents. He says, yeah, actually, that will make me feel better. So apparently Jack had contacts with an expert, a forensics expert, who formerly consulted for Scotland Yard. He's fairly well known, but he doesn't want to include his name, fair enough. He was at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and he analysed fragments of these documents. He said he didn't damage them. He just took off small parts just off the bottom of the document. And he took them in and they were analysed, and it came back that, yes, the ink, the paper, like even some of the photos, they all came from a series of notebooks that were put out in 1947, 1948, 1949, and 1950.
Huh.
So he was able, this is how good he was able to actually match the manufacturing of the paper and the notebooks that have been utilized for this. So he said, okay, well, this is intriguing because he said, on top of everything that was being described, there was some inference here that things like the Pentium processor had come from this, that the Cray supercomputer had been developed from this. There were communication devices. There were extremely micro-thin transistors that had been created.
Any kind of modern computer technology.
Anything modern was there. But there's also more secretive technologies that the American Computer Corporation ended up utilizing from these documents. And that's what I'm going to describe in the plus extension when we come back. There is a technology out there that may still be being developed right now that has come from these documents, and simply because Jack was allowed to see these things and the military didn't care. No one wanted to know about it, which is a really weird thing. It's like what you're describing with the threat from China. It seems like even though he'd gotten access to all this information, when it started spreading out, no one cared. No one did anything until Jack tried to develop one of the technologies. And when he did, his life was turned completely upside down, including death threats.
So are you still going to try and make the argument that we don't need to worry about America's military?
Well, I mentioned force field technologies.
Force field?
So I will, in the plus extension as well, come back to that force field technology. And what it relates to is that apparently there was a secretive division just simply known as the Z Division. The Z Division was a segment of the United States Army that was working within Bell Laboratories that was utilizing these technologies to transfer them to aircraft and to vessels. Potentially that may come up. And here, believe it or not, right, this is a little thing, is that Z Division apparently originated in Roswell, New Mexico.
Oh, that's weird. Because I've just been reading The Ultimate Cold Case by Thomas Carey and Donald Schmidt.
Oh, yeah.
Schmidt, sorry. Their Roswell book, their 20th Roswell book. Because, they've written about 50 of these books on Roswell.
I get really disappointed with Roswell because whenever someone says, oh, you guys should talk about Roswell, like, I know Roswell. I've done it so many times. But then I realize, Roswell really is a story that just keeps on giving because you keep on finding new details.
Imagine how these guys feel. They've written 50 books on it. So their latest one is the promise that it's their last Roswell book. They basically state, no, guys, this is the last one. This is their case closed book. And they make lots of arguments to the kind of fall along the same lines that you're talking about, especially in terms of the memory metal that was supposedly retrieved from the Roswell crash site. They revealed that there was actually 3 Roswell crash sites. They've got a ton of deathbed confessions that have been newly released.
Well, that's the thing, right? So anyone that was involved in Roswell and the cover-up, we're getting to that point now where they're all getting to that point where they're passing on.
Oh, no, they're all dead. There's no one left. I don't think there's anyone left from the original
But what
incident.
I mean is that we're actually getting to the point now where there has been deathbed confessions and families are more willing to just give that information out because it was so long ago.
Yeah, and Anthony Bragalia, one of their co-investigators, believes he's found the private company, the military contractor that was responsible for reverse engineering the memory metal.
Oh, and okay, so this is part of what I'm going to go into. So part of Z Division was, yes, it was this, super secret group. But essentially, this is what is described by, I think it was Corso, Philip J. Corso, that he was tasked by the president to distribute these technologies, like the actual samples of this technology, to multiple private organizations so that they could develop and patent them. And then so there was like an even spread of the technology amongst other companies.
Yeah, there's tons of quotes from Battelle, for example, was one of the contractors that their lab technicians started talking about this strange metal that came into them. Right. And it's always just listed as foreign technology.
Exactly, yep. Foreign.
I mean, that's all they're told. This is foreign technology. But it does fall in line with what the eyewitnesses said about the crash site and some of the whistleblowers, so that were told to go out into a field with a bag and pick it up. Yeah. Clean up the whole area.
Jack makes this allegation that even at one point, Bell Laboratories, when they had the prototype of the integrated circuit, the integrated circuit and the transistor, what it essentially was is that it was part of the communications array that was from the actual Roswell craft. And they'd placed it, and what they had done is that they had put it inside this like display box, and they were utilizing it to test it and to try and create. It took Bell Laboratories over a year to just simply be able to replicate it to do a very small percentage of what the initial artifact was capable of doing. And they still have it somewhere, apparently. Apparently, it's hidden away somewhere. But obviously, the technology has now been built upon because we had a very crude understanding of what it was. I mean, it's almost like giving a kid a laptop and saying, well, here you go, take it apart and reproduce it. Your kid's going to, draw a picture of it at best, be like, here you go. And that's kind of what human beings did. The capabilities of these technologies is just beyond anything, but it's enough. And it's enough for us to use it.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing your argument. I do hope, for the record, that you are correct and there is some kind of trump card.
Nothing to worry about.
To combat the assassin's mace that is clearly being developed by China. I'll link to Stealth War from Robert Spalding, along with Deceiving the Sky from Bill Gertz and The Kill Chain by Christian Brose in the show notes. And if we have time in our Plus extension, we're going to be going into John Billman's The Cold Vanish, Seeking the Missing in North America's Wildlands, a new look at the missing Fawn 1 phenomena. That's all available on our Plus membership. Head to mysteriously.org/plus for all the details. If you sign up, you get access to the big extensions we do every single Friday on the end of these shows. You typically over an hour long. And if you sign up for Plus, you also get an entirely exclusive season that comes out on Tuesdays. You get a concurrently running season that runs along with these shows. Exclusive to Plus members. It's only $9 a month, so the best way to help support this show. In addition to the extra shows, if you're on Plus, you also get a higher sound quality version of the show. You get discounts off digital products in our store. You get to use all the features in our apps, and you get a totally ad-free experience of the podcast. Again, mysteriousuniverse.org/plus, $9 a month. Sign up today. That's a wrap for this free edition of the show. Thanks for listening. If you're on Plus, stick around for the great stuff after the break. For everyone else, we'll catch you next week. Welcome back to your Plus extension. Great to have you with us. Aaron is going to